Good morning, guys. Um, so today I'm going to read chapter 7 and 8 of the big question. Sorry, I'm trying to wake up. Alright, so chapter 7, the quest for meaning and the limits of science. Scientists are human beings because they are scientists. Highly developed ideas about how the universe works. Because they are human beings, they also have views on deeper questions, such as, among many other things, the meaning of their own individual existences, and how to live a good life. But what happens if science cannot answer these deeper questions? In the end, most scientists end up believing rather a lot of things that lie beyond the scope of the scientific method. These are things that really matter to us, not the shallow natural sciences. They are intrinsic to the scientific method itself. The scientists rightly declare that science can only ascertain what is, not what should be. Outside its domain of value, judgments of all kinds remain necessary. Now, not everyone agrees with this. Some, such as the philosopher Bertrand Russell, argue that there are, as a matter of fact, no limits to the scope of the natural sciences. Whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. This neat little overstatement has never persuaded me. For a start, the logic is deeply flawed. What science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. It is not actually a scientific statement at all. So if it is true, every statement on this board is false. More worryingly, what about the great truths of logic and mathematics, fields that Russell knew very well, which offer proofs of an intellectual rigor that exceed anything that the natural sciences can offer? Surely we can know those. In this chapter, we shall reflect on whether there are limits to science and what the implications of this might be. To begin with, we shall consider ultimate questions and reflect on how we can answer them, if of course we can answer them at all. Let's go back to the great Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, with whom we engaged earlier in this work. As we noted earlier, Ortega makes an important observation concerning the place of natural sciences in human culture. Scientific truth is characterized by its precision and the certainty of its predictions, but science achieves these admirable qualities at the cost of remaining on the level of secondary concerns, leaving ultimate and decisive questions untouched. Ortega points out that because scientists are human beings, they need to go further than science can legitimately take us. Science nourishes part, but only a small part, of the human quest for wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. If science, using its proper methods, comes to a halt at a certain point, we as human beings long to go further and explore what lies beyond the scientific horizon. How can anyone live if we silence these ultimate dramatic questions? Where does the world come from, and where is it going? What is the supreme power of the cosmos? What is the essential meaning of life? We cannot breathe if we are confined to a realm of secondary and intermediate themes. We need a comprehensive perspective, una perspectiva integra, with primary and ultimate levels, not a fractured landscape, or a truncated horizon which lacks the awe evoked by infinite distances. Because we are human beings, we cannot avoid asking ultimate questions. It is an insight reinforced by the cognitive science of religion. And we have three main options here. We can choose to ignore these questions. We can try to answer them using science itself, pushing it to its limits, or we can use multiple maps or narratives to flesh out a purely scientific description. Let's consider each of those three possibilities. 1. Ignoring ultimate questions. First, we can either dismiss or ignore these ultimate questions about meaning and purpose. We might agree that they might be interesting. In fact, they might even be important. But if they cannot be answered, why worry about them? The moment we step outside the safe world of science, we find ourselves in the wastelands of philosophy or theology. Who wants to go there? Let's limit ourselves to the world of what has been proved and ignore what lies behind it. This choice is attractive to some. It is safe. It is seen as a safe option, following the stern intellectual precept of the mathematician W.K. Clifford. It is wrong always, everywhere, and anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. It is a noble statement with which I agree entirely in principle, but it is hard to make it work in the real world. No more than a platitude. Why? For a start, there is a major problem with that elusive word insufficient. Who decides what counts as sufficient evidence and what does not? A judgment itself lying beyond the reach of evidence. It required in order to determine how much evidence is required to legitimize a belief. Clifford was a mathematician used to working within a world of theorems in which conclusive proof was a realistic possibility, but outside the world of mathematics and logic, things are a lot more ambiguous and fuzzy. In fact, this approach turns out to have limited relevance even within the natural sciences, despite its initial promise. What about rival theories that are empirically equivalent, that is to say, deemed to be equally supported by the available evidence? We have already seen that two distinguished Oxford biologists, Richard Dawkins and Dennis Noble, set out diametrically opposed approaches to the causality of genes which cannot be resolved experimentally. But other examples are easily given. For instance, why did the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory win out over hidden variable theories or the de Broglie-Bohm theory when these three are empirically equivalent? Why did the Copenhagen theory gain most support when it was no more successful at explaining the evidence than its rivals? The answer lies in the contingencies of history, not in the scientific evidence itself. Furthermore, as the modern debates about cosmology indicate, many theories that were once believed to be well evidenced eventually turn out to be inadequate or completely wrong. We may think for excellent reasons that something is right today. In the future, it may be seen to be wrong. And for the same reasons, we may think that something is wrong today, and in the future, it may seem to be right. The recognition of the difficulties with the seemingly simple idea of a crucial experiment and of the general underdetermination of theory by evidence date from after Clifford's time. Clifford's intention in formulating this principle was excellent. Its application turns out to be rather more complicated and ambivalent. In practice, human beings tend to work with a more pragmatic criteria of justification than those allowed by Clifford. It is not because people are fools, quite the reverse. It is because they can see the obvious problems with his approach. The Harvard psychologist William James emphasized that we have to search for truth in a world in which the evidence is profoundly ambivalent and open to multiple interpretations. If the true goal of intellectual inquiry is to identify true beliefs rather than simply avoid error, then one will sometimes have to take the risk of believing something to be true without compelling evidence that this is the case. It may be noted here that Darwin's approach in Origin of Species is much more supportive of James' viewpoint than Clifford's, especially in regard to coping with the counter-evidence that Darwin knew posed a significant threat to his theory. And perhaps most importantly, what about great questions of meaning and ethics which are integral to human existence? These clearly lie beyond the scope of Clifford's absurd and severely limited account of the legitimate outcomes of human rationality. We can, of course, close these discussions down and declare them to be improper. We can be like Richard Dawkins and declare that taking non-scientific answers to ultimate questions seriously and merely resorting to superstition. Yet pronouncing this kind of rationalist incantation does not solve anything. As William James pointed out, we still end up having to make big decisions, usually moral, and need to base these on something. We cannot opt out of life and value-based decisions that we need to make, hoping science can answer ultimate questions. The second approach concedes the importance of such ultimate questions, but argues that science will eventually be capable of answering all of life's fundamental questions, provided that they do have answers. If reality is like a landscape, there may be parts of it which are beyond the reach of science then at the moment, but eventually science will be able to answer all of life's questions. It is just a matter of time, and if science cannot answer a question, then there is no answer to be given. Richard Dawkins holds that science can answer all of life's great questions, and if it cannot answer them today, it will be able to answer them in the future. Since science discloses no meaning to the universe, the only reasonable conclusion is that there is no meaning to find. This comment is worth repeating. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Dawkins tries to resolve this problem of meaning by developing the idea of a universal Darwinism, which inflates Darwin's provisional scientific account of the origin of species into a grand meta-narrative, able to answer ultimate questions about meaning and morality. Dawkins himself uses this informing Darwinian meta-narrative to generate his own moral values, some of which have generated considerable controversy. In 2014, he declared categorically that it would be immoral for a mother to allow a pregnancy to continue if it was known that the fetus had Down syndrome. Dawkins issued this piece of moral guidance in response to a woman who admitted she would face a real ethical dilemma if she became pregnant and learned that the baby would be born with a disorder. Dawkins tweeted what many thought to be an insensitive and callous response: abort it and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice. Yet Dawkins' moral judgment, although perhaps delivered with what might seem to some to be indecent haste and widely ridiculed, was perfectly consistent with the Darwinian meta-narrative that informed it. So how reliable is that meta-narrative? To its critics, it represents a metaphysically bloated Darwinism recontextualized within 21st century debates. Darwin had been transfigured into an iconographic figurehead of viewpoints which he did not advocate and for which he probably would have had a little sympathy. This Darwinian ideology represents what George Steiner provocatively termed a substitute theology, a system of belief whose structures and aspirations are religious in strategy and in effect, though not, of course, in name. The major difficulty that Dawkins faces here concerns the transition from Darwin's provisional and incorrigible theory of natural selection to a universally valid narrative of meaning. After all, Dawkins himself rightly emphasized the provisionality of Darwin's approach, which it shares with all other scientific theories. New facts may come to light which will force our successors of our 21st century to abandon Darwinism or modify it beyond recognition. To give him due credit, Dawkins rightly realized that if science was to have deeper cultural traction, it needed to develop a deeper and broader narrative about reality from which moral values could be developed. One of the most thoughtful critics of the view that science can provide robust and reliable answers to questions of value and meaning is the Nobel laureate Sir Pierre Medawar, a paragon of rationalism, whom Richard Dawkins once described as the chief spokesman of the scientists in the modern world. Medawar achieved respect far beyond the scientific community on account of his willingness to engage creatively and constructively with the humanities, recognizing the respective strengths and weaknesses of every intellectual discipline, including his own. Medawar had no hesitation in denouncing mystical nonsense wherever and whenever he found it. And in his celebrated dismissal of the French paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's mystical views of evolution, which he regarded being as credible only to those capable of rational thought, yet Medawar was aware of the danger of exaggerating the reach of either science or reason. Young scientists, he wrote once, must never mistake the necessity of reason for the sufficiency of reason. Rationalism, he declared, falls short of answering the many simple and childlike questions that people ask about their origins and purposes. It is not to rationalism that we look for answers to these simple questions, but rationalism chides the endeavor to look at all. Medawar's position on the limits of science diverges radically from Dawkins. Medawar drew a distinction between transcendent questions which he thought were best left to religion and metaphysics, and in questions about the organization and structure of the material universe, which were dealt with authoritatively by the natural sciences. Medawar insisted that it is very likely that there are limits to science given the existence of questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. Some, such as those whom Medawar dismisses as doctrinaire positivists, would ridicule these questions, dismissing them as non-questions or pseudo-questions, such as only simpletons ask, and only charlatans, one of a kind or another, profess to be able to answer. Such a glib response, Medawar suggests, leaves people empty and dissatisfied. These questions are both real and important to those who ask them. using multiple maps and meanings to answer ultimate questions. The third approach advocated in this work is to recognize the importance and legitimacy of these ultimate questions and use multiple maps of meaning to offer an enriched but not an inflated vision of reality, engaging both cognitive and existential questions. It is part of our human nature to see a richer and deeper vision of reality, which enables us to do justice to the complexity of the world and live out meaningful and fulfilling lives. Even Sigmund Freud, who may well have been the least religious person of the 20th century, knew that there was some deep instinct of human nature that causes us to seek meaning and transcendence. We look for reassurance that however fragmented our world of experience may seem, at times there is a richer narrative which holds things together in a coherent web of meaning. That is what the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein was getting at when he declared that to believe in God means to see that life has meaning. As I have made clear throughout this work, I have found that the Christian faith offers a persuasive and deeply satisfying enrichment of a scientific engagement with reality. While I give some of the reasons underlying my judgment in this work, I do not expect all of my readers to agree with me. After all, my position can be criticized on perfectly reasonable grounds. The most important of these, in my view, is the perception that Christianity rests on a less secure evidential foundation than the natural sciences. I concede this concern, although I must point out that it needs qualification in two important respects. For a start, we need to remind ourselves of the provisionality of all scientific judgments. What is accepted today may be rejected tomorrow as further evidence becomes available. Furthermore, any worldview, including Dawkins' metaphysically inflated Darwinism, lies beyond empirical verification. As the writings of Thomas Aquinas, G.K. Chesterton, and C.S. Lewis make clear, Christianity may certainly be justified in that good reasons may be given for accepting its ideas. It cannot, however, be proved to be right, but neither can atheism or Buddhism or anything that goes beyond the domain of the empirical, including any quest for meaning in life or for a viable morality. The human condition is such that only shallow truths can be proved. The deepest truths lie beyond absolute proof, but may nevertheless be trusted. In the end, we have to recognize that all three of the approaches just outlined cause, or certainly ought to cause, those who hold them a certain degree of intellectual discomfort. None of them is self-evidently right. Despite the bullying rhetoric and condescending tone of some cultural commentators with vested interests in the matter, all of them face intellectual challenges which are easily ignored, dismissed, or misrepresented by earnest ideologues, yet which are rightly troubling to genuine seekers after truth. Yet we have to make a choice between them, and we'll have to make a choice believing that it is justified. That is not necessarily a bad thing. As the literary critic Terry Eagleton noted, we hold many beliefs that have no impeachably rational justification, but are nonetheless reasonable to entertain. In this book, I have set out a proposed narrative of enrichment, reconnecting science and faith. This, I must emphasize, denies nothing about the empirical sciences except any spurious claims to exclusivism or finality on their part. That may be in conflict with the scientism characteristic of the new atheism, but it is certainly not in conflict with science, which has always been willing to recognize its limits, knowing that it raises questions that transcend its capability to answer them, questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. So does engaging such questions meaning abandoning science? No, it simply means acknowledging and respecting its limits and not forcing it to become something other than science. Christianity is able to enrich this vision of science, not by proposing itself as a competing science, but by being what it is and doing what it does best, which is raising and answering ultimate questions. Of course, it does much more than this, but it does this distinctively and it does it well, and it needs to be done. The important point here is that science and faith can thus provide us with different yet ultimately complementary maps of human identity. As Mary Midgley suggests, Christian theology offers us a mental map which helps us to make sense of at least some aspects of the worlds within us and around us. And I think I must emphasize to make sense of the scientific enterprise in particular. That is the point made by William Ing and former Lady Margaret, professor of divinity in Cambridge University. God is not something that we prove by direct observation, as if God were a hitherto unnoticed moon orbiting the planet Mars. Rather, God is the ground of our existence and understanding in the first place. Rationalism tries to find a place for God in its picture of the world, but God cannot be fitted into a diagram. He is rather the canvas on which the picture is painted, or the frame in which it is set. For Ing, the Christian faith offers a conceptual framework, a mental map, which both accommodates and encourages the scientific enterprise, as well as illuminates our understanding of the world and ourselves within it. We need a canvas like that, something which can bear the weight of the world around us and our experiences within us, supporting and holding together a rich, textured reality. What about the question of meaning? Let's begin by reflecting on why this is so important to human beings and explore whether science can help us with this grand question of life. There is now a firm consensus within the psychological research literature that having a sense of meaning to life matters to human well being. The ability to discern meaning within the complex pattern of events in our lives and in the world helps us cope with ambiguity and bewilderment. The great Harvard psychologist William James made this point in an 1895 lecture entitled Is Life Worth Living? James pointed out that a belief in the meaningfulness of life helped establish a resilience in the face of life's challenges. Believe that life is worth living, and your belief will help create the fact. Many readers will be familiar with the work of Viktor Frankl, an Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist who was interned in a series of Nazi concentration camps during the Second World War. His experiences in those camps led him to realize the importance of discerning meaning if people were to cope with traumatic and seemingly meaningless situations. Frankl argued that survival in these situations depended on maintaining the will to live, which in turn depended on the discernment of meaning and purpose in even the most demoralizing situations, which were directly experienced as threats to survival and self-preservation. Those who coped best were those who had frameworks of meaning that enabled them to accommodate their experiences within their mental maps. In making this point, Frankl quoted the German philosopher Nietzsche, the person who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow. The role of theories of meaning, especially religious beliefs, is enabling people to cope with negative situations is thus well established, and its implications for dealing with those who face traumatic life events are being explored in pastoral care and nursing, to mention only two important fields. There is a growing realization of the importance of meaning-focused coping in which people draw on their beliefs, religious, spiritual, or beliefs about justice, values mattering in existential goals, purpose in life, or guiding principles, to motivate and sustain coping and well-being during a difficult time. Religious faith generates resilience and an ability to cope with situations that transcend a mere ability to understand. In an influential study, the social psychologist Roy Baumeister summarized the findings of the research literature under four broad headings. People feel a need to make sense of their lives and search for four main types of meaning: purpose, value, a sense of efficacy, and a basis for self-worth. Although these four main needs for meaning could, in principle, be derived from a single source, empirical research suggests that people tend to draw meaning from multiple sources, including religion, work, family, and personal relationships. These multiple sources of meaning in life protect individuals from the threat of meaninglessness, and that the erosion of one such source of meaning, for example, through a breakdown in family life, does not entail a total loss of meaning. Empirical studies do not identify science as a significant source of meaning for most people, for example, in the quest for happiness and fulfillment. Yet this does not mean that science cannot help illuminate the issues. Humans are meaning-seeking animals. Let's look at one recent discussion of the relevance of science for our understanding of the meaning of life. In his recent book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality, the atheist philosopher Alex Rosenberg sets out his understanding of what science can tell us about life's greatest questions. Rosenberg makes it clear that the only reality is that which can be disclosed by the application of the scientific method. Science provides all the significant truths about reality, and knowing such truths is what real understanding is all about. Being scientific just means treating science as our exclusive guide to reality, to nature, both to our own nature and everything else's. The Atheist's Guide to Reality demolishes all of the great questions of philosophy and religion on the assumption that science is our exclusive guide to reality. To save his readers having to follow his arguments in detail, Rosenberg provides a neat synopsis of life's big questions, along with what he considers to be scientifically reliable answers. A few examples. Is there a God? No. What is the nature of reality? What physics says it is. What is the purpose of the universe? There is none. What is the meaning of life? Ditto. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. Each of these points is developed in much greater detail later in the book. Rosenberg provides a thoroughly consistent exploration of an atheist worldview based on the core assumption that really is limited to and defined by what the natural sciences, especially physics, are able to uncover. There is nothing beyond or behind the science. We have to be nihilists about the purpose of things in general, about the purpose of biological life in particular, and the purpose of life in general. Therefore, if science cannot disclose purpose in life, there is none to disclose. Rosenberg tells us that this is a nice nihilism. To me, it is just a reductive physicalism which claims that everything is just bosons and fermions. Adding the word nice is purely cosmetic. It seems to me that Rosenberg needs to reflect on the words of the poet Muriel Rukeyser. The universe is made of stories, not of atoms. Rukeyser is attuned to the subjective dimensions of life, the things that give human life meaning, where Rosenberg thinks only of coldly objective facts. Yet, in a puzzling mood, Rosenberg declares that it is beyond reasonable doubt that a core morality exists. That is to say, a set of behavioral rules observed by all, or nearly all, societies across time. That is one of the main observations of C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. Lewis interprets this in a strongly theistic manner. Rosenberg would doubtless object, but his concession opens the door to alternative visions of morality which are rather more persuasive and useful than those he himself appears to wish to adopt. There is also a serious issue here, which Rosenberg fails to deal with adequately. Is this core morality simply a historical given, which we have to accept whether we like it or not? Even the most pliable reader of Rosenberg's book might wonder whether those moral givens might require review and revision, particularly in the light of rapid cultural change. Yet Rosenberg offers us no means by which science can offer an alternative moral vision on the basis of which traditional ethical values might be corrected. Rosenberg's philosophical rigor thus leads him to a moral nihilism in that there are no correct answers to moral questions. His critics would respond by arguing that this is not proper science at all. This is scientism, understood as the rather narrow and doctrinative view that reality is limited to what the scientific method can disclose. It is also deeply problematic. How on earth could physics itself demonstrate that reality consists of only the kinds of things that physics recognizes? Many will feel that the philosopher Roger Scruton puts his finger on a deep concern of the entire scientific enterprise. Scientism involves the use of scientific forms and categories in order to give the appearance of science to unscientific ways of thinking. It is a form of magic, a bid to reassemble the complex matter of human life as the magician's command in a shape over which he can exert control in an attempt to subdue what it does not understand. Rosenberg's views are framed in terms of a specific vision of reality, from which such issues as meaning and value are excluded for methodological reasons, in that the scientific method does not and cannot engage them. That is why Murray Midgley argues that we need multiple maps of reality to enable us to avoid being improperly limited by when he says that science cannot tell us what is right. We are going to look at Sam Harris's flawed proposal that science can determine the moral values in the next chapter. Harris' defiant and unpersuasive affirmation that science can tell us what is moral needs to be set against Rosenberg's robust and persuasive intellectual defense that it cannot. But that does not mean that we are unable to determine what is right or wrong. It just means that science cannot tell us the answers. So it is like saying that reading a book on advanced nuclear physics cannot tell me how to get from Oxford to London. Knowing the structure of DNA design cannot tell me whether democracy is better than fascism. Evolutionary biology cannot tell me whether Mr. Collins is the hero of Pride and Prejudice, the date of the Battle of Waterloo, or the name of the second president of the United States of America. Now, if science can help us answer these questions and countless others like them, that is great. If not, we just look somewhere else for the answers. Life, most readers will conclude, is about rather more than bosons, and fermions. Science is a tool designed to answer certain questions and not others. We abuse science if we force it to answer the wrong questions, and we abuse ourselves if we pretend that because this specific tool cannot answer moral or existential questions, there are no good answers to be found. Tools are designed for specific purposes, and if they are used for something else, we should not be surprised if they do not work. Why many of us will wonder, can there not be things that can be discovered only by non scientific means if they cannot be discovered at all? Rosenberg's bold atheist manifesto has more to say, however. There is one more illusion that needs to be shattered by his rigorous scientific thinking. Rosenberg argues that as a result of our biological hardwiring, we believe many things that are actually wrong. Our evolutionary past affects and distorts our ability to reason. There is strong evidence that natural selection produces lots of false but useful beliefs. Rosenberg's critics might, I think, be entitled to wonder whether the statement science provides all the significant truths about reality is one of them. But Rosenberg cuts the ground from under his critics in a dramatic move by undermining the credibility of thought in the first place. Thinking about things, he tells us, is an overwhelmingly powerful illusion. Ultimately, science and scientism are going to make us give up as illusory the very thing conscious experience screams out at us loudest and longest. The notion that when we think, our thoughts are about anything at all, inside or outside of our minds. This self-referentiality will leave most readers baffled. If we are naturally predisposed to have lots of false but useful beliefs, how then can we identify which of our beliefs are false and correct them? After all, beliefs can only be true or false if they relate to something. Rosenberg sets out to liberate his readers from their illusions, but offers them no reliable criteria for identifying what is illusory and what is true. Rosenberg disallows us the tools we need to determine whether we are moving from illusion to truth or simply from one illusion to another. The best rebuttals of this approach do not come from religious writers who often merely assume that it is bizarre that it refutes itself, but from mainstream philosophers. Let me explore the approach set out by my colleague Timothy Williamson, presently Wykeham's professor of logic at the University of Oxford. Williamson points out that one obvious challenge to the kind of scientific imperialism developed by Rosenberg and others is that it has difficulty accounting for the success of mathematics. Noted earlier, naturalism privileges the scientific method over all others, and mathematics is one of the most spectacular success stories in the history of human knowledge. Yet mathematics does not use experimental or empirical methods, but proves its results by pure reasoning. It does not fit into Rosenberg's severely impoverished account of how we investigate reality. If we do not treat pure mathematics as a science, we are obliged to exclude mathematical proof from our understanding of the scientific method. After all, Williamson argues mathematical proof is just as effective a route to knowledge as experimental or observational methods. Williamson concludes that any attempt to condense the scientific spirit into a philosophical theory will fail, since no theory can replace that spirit. Indeed, he concludes naturalism as dogma is one more enemy of the scientific spirit. Perhaps more importantly, Williamson goes on to challenge the fundamental basis of Rosenberg's nice nihilism with an argument that may well prove to be the final nail in its coffin. Williamson invites us to consider that the extreme naturalist claim that all truths are discoverable by hard science. Why should we believe that this is right? What is its evidential basis? Williamson's response to this question needs to be read at least twice to grasp the point he is making. But once Williamson's point has been grasped, the plausibility of Rosenberg's position simply evaporates. If it is true that all truths are discoverable by hard science, then it is discoverable by hard science, and all truths are discoverable by hard science. But it is not discoverable by hard science that all truths are discoverable by hard science. Are all truths discoverable by hard science? It is not a question of hard science, therefore the extreme naturalist claim is not true. When I was a science student at Oxford University back in the early 1970s, the main philosophical talking point among undergraduates was the logical positivism of A.J. Ayer and his circle. Ayer, who was one of Williamson's predecessors at Wykeham Professor of Logic at Oxford from 1959 to 1978, famously asserted that a statement could be meaningful only if it was analytic. For example, all vertebrates have backbones, or empirically verifiable. For example, there are fish in the ocean. This verification principle thus held that all metaphysical statements and judgments of value were meaningless or subjective and therefore of no philosophical significance. Those of us who were scientists tended to regard our fellow students in the humanities who held this position with slightly bemused contempt, although they claimed to be scientific. In their approach, they often seemed to know remarkably little about scientific practice or theory development. Instead, they tended to focus exclusively on the question of what would make the language of philosophical discourse meaningful, that is, empirically verifiable, without giving due attention to the problems that any scientist knew were associated with such a claim. We could see that this verification principle led to the puzzling conclusion that scientific laws were meaningless statements and that they could not be verified in the strict sense of the term. Why? Because the corrigible nature of science leads to the conclusion that there are no statements that we can hold as absolutely true on empirical grounds. Despite its supposedly empirical basis, the verification principle actually excludes all scientific laws, and therefore most of the scientific enterprise is meaningless. But if we could also see something else, by its own criteria of meaning, the verification principle was meaningless. It was itself a metaphysical assertion that could not be verified on the basis of its own criteria of judgment. And that is the same problem that emerges with the kind of overstated scientific imperialism that we find exemplified in Rosenberg, such as the absolutist, simplistic, and unverifiable, or the unverifiable statement that science provides all the significant truths about reality. Any suggestion that science is an exclusive guide to reality cannot be justified by an appeal to science without assuming that this conclusion is true. It is a circular argument comparable to the fatally flawed verification principle in terms of its scope and foundations. So where does this leave us? The simple truth is that none of this has much relevance for most practitioners of the natural sciences, who widely avoid metaphysical speculation as a matter of principle and would probably regard Rosenberg's views as eccentric and totally unrepresentative of science. The kind of methodological naturalism which is intrinsic to the theory and practice of science concerns how reality is to be investigated and does not predetermine either the form or extent of that reality. This naturalism is a premise of the scientific method, not its conclusion. A working assumption can easily be petrified as a worldview. The problem starts when we assume that science gives us exclusive access to the truth. Rosenberg inflates his judgments both verbally and evidentially. He declares that science tells us that there is no moral difference between good and evil. That is just nonsense. I can only assume that he really means that science cannot tell us what is good or evil, a judgment with which I happily agree. Believing with Rosenberg that science tells us there is no moral difference between good and evil runs counter to the most fundamental instincts and values of humanity. Above all, the belief in the importance of struggling against evil and injustice. Science is a vitally important tool for investigating our world and living within it, but it illuminates only part of the picture, not the whole picture. To think otherwise is a delusion, and we need that whole picture if we are to live authentic and meaningful lives. Okay, now let me check. Okay, good. So now, Chapter 8, in Empirical Ethics, Science and Morality. Teenagers are expected to rebel against the banalities of conventional wisdom. I certainly did. As a rather doctrinaire teenage atheist, I regarded life as meaningless and my bold declaration of cosmic pointlessness as an act of intellectual bravery. As I saw things, I was bold enough to tell the bleak and austere truth where others wallowed in the consoling delusion that life was somehow meaningful. Now, iconoclasm is great fun, but it is not especially productive. The downside of rebelling against an established position is that you are expected to provide constructive alternatives. This proved to be a little harder for me. One option certainly lay to hand. Some of the younger teachers at my school had been influenced by the radical thinkers of the late 1960s who held that moral judgments merely expressed personal feelings or attitudes rather than expressing something that was intrinsically right or wrong. This might have been fashionable. It seemed intellectual nonsense to me. Surely there was a better way of pursuing the good life than either buying into a nonsensical, self-serving individualism or following the dull moral conventions of the age. It did not take me long to find my answer. Science could tell us what is right and good. It solved my dilemma perfectly at the time. It seemed to be both culturally radical and yet intellectually robust. Ethics was about making decisions that would advance or hinder human well being. Since science was able to measure human well being, it could tell us what is good for us and what is bad for us. Empirical facts determine what is right and what is wrong, not social convention or individual feelings. In effect, I was arguing that science was a kind of meta language which was able to judge the validity of all other forms of human discourse and of intellectual enterprise. I shared my ideas with some of my friends in my last year at school before going into Oxford University to study science in more detail. They were irritatingly obtuse, failing to grasp either the elegance or simplicity of what I proposed. One objected that I believed to be scientifically verifiable more values were nothing more than empirical facts about how to achieve human well-being, which dubiously equated well-being with morality. Another was prepared to allow that science could inform moral questions, but not that it could answer them. I dismissed these unwelcome criticisms as diluted unscientific obscurantism and thought no more about it. I need hardly add that mine turned out to be a hopelessly naive view of ethics, and freely admit that it took me a few years to figure out why. But we are allowed to be simplistic when we are young. Which Richard Dawkins and I disagree on a number of matters, but there are some things on which we firmly agree. We both love science, and we both think it is intellectually stimulating and aesthetically enriching. And until recently, we both agreed that, to use Dawkins' own words, science has no methods for deciding what is ethical. Dawkins was absolutely right to make this point back in 2003. Anyone who wants to defend the idea of a scientifically grounded morality has to deal with the lingering memory of earlier botched attempts to implement a scientific morality, especially the disastrous ethical experimentations of social Darwinism. In the first third of the 20th century, claiming to be scientific, this rather crude application of Darwinian principles to moral and political thought provided what is now widely seen as a spurious scientific justification for repulsive social policies such as racism and eugenics. However, the memory of such disastrous attempts to base social and political policies on allegedly scientific values has now faded, allowing the emergence of fresh attempts to explore the question of whether moral values can be founded on science, especially neuroscience. Nevertheless, three serious concerns arising from the flawed social Darwinian experiments of the past remain live issue. Experiments of the past remain live issues today and must be addressed. First, many of the supposedly scientific values derived from evolutionary theory were little more than transpositions of what happened in nature to what ought to happen in human society. This all too easy transition from fact to value, this happens, and therefore this is rightly behind some of the more objectionable social policies proposed by social Darwinism. That is why we are right to be skeptical about any suggestion that value-laden policies and practices can be determined solely by empirical investigation. Second, as we have seen in scientific theorization, and any outcomes based upon it is provisional. What one generation might regard as a scientific response to a particular situation thus may be abandoned by a future generation with access to a better understanding of science or to a wider base of empirical knowledge. If we were to define moral values as doing things that enhance the quality of life, we would need to recognize that scientific understanding of what enhances the quality of life has shifted over the years and will continue to shift. And third, moral questions were treated as if they were scientific questions, capable of being answered simply by an appeal to empirical data. This can only be done in two ways, both of which are intellectually unacceptable. First, moral values are surreptitiously smuggled into what is essentially a scientific narrative, for example, by presupposing certain notions of what is good or moral, and then showing how science helps us achieve those goals. Second, by identifying an empirically observable quality as either representing or determining morality, so that the empirical study of this quality can be equated with the scientific determination of moral values. Yet in 2010, Dawkins changed his mind on this critically important point. After reading Sam Harris's Moral Landscape, he declared that he has now realized he had unthinkingly bought into the hectoring myth that science can say nothing about morals. I was surprised by this change of mind, particularly because my own reading of the Moral Landscape reinforced my conviction that science had no privileged insights in the field. Given this book's impact on Dawkins and the importance of the question it raises, we shall consider its fundamental themes on how it bears on the relation of science and the great human quest to live the good life. Sam Harris rose to fame in 2004 as one of the leading representatives of the New Atheism, arguing for a fundamental link between the irrationality of faith and its pursuit of violence, seen, for example, in the 9/11 terror attack in New York City. That critique of religion was accompanied by some rather dubious moral views, such as a rather uncritical defense of the use of torture, and its disturbing argument that some propositions are so dangerous that it may be even ethical to kill people for believing them. It made me wonder what Harris based his ethics on. Happily, Harris had now published an answer to that question. In 2010, he published The Moral Landscape: How Science Can Determine Human Values, in which he argued that science is able to provide a reliable, objective basis for human ethics. This book, based on Harris's 2009 PhD thesis in neuroscience at the University of California, offers a vigorous defense of moral realism in the face of an endemic ethical pluralism and relativism, where many in Western liberal culture endorse, though often fail to implement, and all moral views are equally valid attitude. Harris offers a vigorous defense of the objectivity of moral values, which are held to be valid and binding, whether we like them or not. Harris offers a good critique of some overstatements of evolutionary accounts of ethics, such as the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson's assertion that morality is merely an adaptation to further our reproductive ends. Harris rightly observes that while evolution did not design us to lead deeply fulfilling lives, human ethical reflection can hardly fail to take this goal into account. Few will dispute Harris's judgment that science should increasingly inform our values. For example, it is not difficult to see how the findings of experimental psychology concerning human cognitive biases can help us reason more effectively, a point noted by many moral philosophers as they reflect rather more rigorously than Harris on the nature of goodness. Harris simply tends to assume his definition of morality for the purposes of exploration rather than offer a rigorous defense of it. Yet Harris's approach to ethics goes further than acknowledging and welcoming an informing scientific perspective on moral questions. It clearly demands that science should determine our values. Harris's advocation of a scientific morality has three main elements. Morality concerns improving the well-being of conscious creatures. It concerns the principles of behavior that allows people to flourish. Facts about what promotes and harms the well-being of conscious creatures are accessible to science. Science is thus able to determine what is objectively moral, in that it can determine whether something increases or decreases the well-being of conscious creatures. The core assumption of Harris's approach is that our ethical thinking and moral actions should be motivated by the well-being of conscious creatures. I am personally very sympathetic to this being recognized as one of several core values and of responsible human reflection. But why should it be the only core value? And much more important, just what is the scientific basis of this claim? It is clearly a value judgment, not an empirical observation. It is about what we ought to be doing rather than what is observed. This would be contrasted with Albert Einstein's observation that science can only ascertain what is, not what should be, and outside of its domain value judgments of all kinds remain necessary. That is why Harris has to smuggle in some decidedly unscientific presuppositions in order to allow science to reach certain ethical conclusions that are simply not accessible through the scientific method alone. The scientific account of morality depends upon hidden non-empirical premises. Without intending to do so, Harris makes the case for needing to enrich a scientific narrative with supplementary perspectives, such as those drawn from the world of faith. That is what I think, at least I am open about it. It is interesting to note, as an aside, that Harris' position, if developed consistently, ought to lead him to regard religious faith as an as at least benign and even as moral. Why? Because there is now a large body of serious empirical work on the impact of religious commitment on human well being, which shows a positive observed correlation between faith and well being. Harris's use of the enhancement of well being as a criterion of morality clearly has unintended consequences. Yet this is amusing outcome of his approach must not be allowed to obscure the fact that it is flawed and unworkable. In the end, Harris merely asserts the unattested and inherently untestable hypothesis that morality is to be deemed equivalent to maintaining or enhancing the well-being of conscious creatures. Yet this core initial presupposition does not appear to be derived from any form of empirical investigation, however provisional. It is an unevidenced metaphysical assumption, not a scientific conclusion. So what scientific reasons might be given for preferring Harris's definitions of moral terms over the rival versions offered by social contract theorists, virtue ethicists, or any other of the many schools of moral theory currently active? I do not see any on the offer. Harris's emphasis on the maximization of well-being leads him to adopt the ethical position generally known as utilitarianism, although Harris does not use this term to describe his position. The difficulty with this position are well known. For example, it is easy to envisage morally complex situations in which it would not be clear what actions might maximize well-being, partly arising from disputes over what this well-being is, partly because it is unclear how to measure it. To give one very obvious example of critical social importance, a maximal well-being approach fails to help us work out very scarce medical interventions such as organs and vaccines should be allocated. Harris's approach does not help us work out whether we should treat all people equally, favor the worst off, maximize the total benefits of an intervention, or promote and reward its social usefulness. In practice, these issues are decided on non-scientific grounds such as beliefs about social value, cultural utility, or personal significance, none of which is a scientific notion. Harris is aware of such difficulties in calculating optimal outcome, but argues that these should not be allowed to obscure the general principle of promoting well-being. It is a reasonable point. It is important not to fuss too much about details, yet this makes it clear that Harris's approach suffers from a double deficiency in that it is not merely theoretically indefensible, but it cannot be implemented in practice either. In the end, any viable ethics of this kind needs a metric of well-being, an algorithm of possibilities, which can be evaluated in terms of the amount of well-being that they entail. If Harris's approach has any merit, it is not in an adjudicating between the good and the better, but between good and evil. As, for example, when judging that certain harsh moral traditions are damaging to human beings, yet even then we are occasionally left wondering if things are quite as compelling as Harris believes. For example, Harris argues that there is a scientific rationale for declaring that the Tabbaland treatment of women is objectively morally wrong. Why? Because an enforced wearing of a burqa is not conducive to the well-being of conscious creatures that looks suspiciously like cultural prejudice being dressed up as if it were a scientific fact. In the end, Harris's defense of his ethical method turns out to be philosophical, not scientific. As the philosopher Whitley Kaufman points out, although Harris continually appeals to science, he is in fact defending a contentious and rather implausible moral philosophy. One of the oddities of this book is that the single concrete finding that Harris claims to have made in the book, that utilitarianism is the correct moral theory, the rest is mere promissory notes about a future science of ethics, is not in any reasonable sense a scientific finding. Perhaps this ought to not really surprise us. One of Nietzsche's insights, ignored by the new atheists, is that the problem atheism has with morality is not whether atheists can be moral in some general sense of the word, but rather what specific morality they should serve. The new atheist appeal to science is ultimately an attempt to construct a morality based on something that is not transcendent or divine. yet science simply cannot determine such moral issues. The history of the early 20th century is littered with thoroughly illiberal, occasionally racist attempts to construct a scientific morality, none of which is now taken seriously. So, where does this leave us? Harris's unrealistic and unpersuasive argument for the moral authority of science ignores the difficult history of this enterprise and ultimately rests on unacknowledged core philosophical principles. He presupposes his own conclusions in an interesting but rather pointless act of intellectual circularity. This unsatisfactory essay in moral reflection in little more than uncritical manifesto of a rather unperspective form of scientism, which seeks to extend the scope of science through a rhetorical trivialization of the moral authority of its obvious cultural alternatives, philosophy and religion, and having created an artificial moral vacuum, Harrison inflates science to occupy this space. But there is no moral vacuum that needs to be filled in this way. Moral philosophy and theology have a long history of reflection on the classic themes of ethics and their application to everyday life. Science can and should inform our thinking about ethics, but as Harris' failed experiment in scientific morality makes clear, it cannot function as the basis of ethics. In fact, despite all the hyped up publicity surrounding this book, I do not think that Harris himself really believes that this is the case. Neither science nor scientists have any privileged insights into what is good or how to achieve it. Harris needs to reconnect with the mainstream of moral reflection, not try to set himself above it. In an earlier chapter, we explored Darwin's theory of evolution and reflected on some of its implications. One such implication which needs to be considered in more detail is whether a Darwinian meta-narrative itself provides a basis for ethical reflection, either by showing that some of our most firmly established moral values are actually hangovers from our evolutionary past, or by offering its own set of such values. The debates about the relation of evolution and ethics can be traced back to the 19th century. Herbert Spencer, perhaps best known for inventing the phrase "the survival of the fittest" to describe Darwin's principle of natural selection, was an enthusiastic advocate of evolutionary ethics. The critical reception he experienced was partly due to some questionable assumptions, particularly the rather dubious biological presupposition that evolution tended toward the great happiness. What came to be known as social Darwinism generally held that the strong should be encouraged to become stronger. For example, through encouraging economic competition between individuals through laissez-faire capitalism, or through the manipulation of social structures. It was perhaps inevitable that the popularization of Darwin's theory would lead to the emergence of forms of social Darwinism. Although it is important to note that this is not a necessary consequence of Darwin's theory of natural selection, rather it arises from regarding natural patterns underlying the phenomenon of evolution as being normative for human beings, arguing from observation of natural processes to the imposition of moral systems. Paradoxically, some of the themes evident in social Darwinism are actually Lamarckian rather than Darwinian. It is also important to note that other leading advocates of evolution in the late 19th century, such as Thomas Henry Huxley and Alfred Russel Wallace, were strongly opposed to the extension of evolution to the realm of morality, partly because they believed it could not be done, but perhaps mainly because they believed it should not be done. Huxley's views on this were made explicitly clear in his Romanes lecture at Oxford University in 1893, entitled Evolution and Ethics. Let us understand once and for all. Huxley declared that the ethical progress of society depends not on imitating the cosmic process, still less in running away from it, but in combating it. The most severe early critic of evolutionary ethics was the great philosopher G.E. Moore. Some see Moore as extending David Hume's earlier observation that was logically impossible to move from a set of purely factual premises to a normative conclusion. This, in his Principia Ethica, Moore set out his concerns about developing an ethical theory based on the observation of natural processes such as evolution, inventing the term naturalistic fallacy to refer to the error he believed to lie at the heart of Spencer's evolutionary ethics. So what was the error? For Moore, the notion of goodness was not capable of being determined or measured by any empirical means. Moore accused Spencer of committing the naturalist fallacy, which consists in identifying the simple notion which we mean by good with some other notion. Spencer's equation of good with happiness was indefensible. Moore's critique of Spencer goes beyond the simple idea that what is found in nature is good. It is based on the deeper idea that the good cannot be correlated with empirical observations. While I personally find Moore's intuitionism, the idea that we recognize the goodness of an act just as we recognize whether something is yellow, unpersuasive, his criticism of Spencer remains important and is easily extended more to recent speculation about science and ethics. Evolutionary ethics faltered from about 1920 to 1975, largely because its problems were seen to outweigh any slight benefits it might bring. The situation changed, however, when the publication of Edward L. Wilson's book Sociobiology, the final sections of which argued that the evolutionary basis of ethics should be recognized. Scientists and humanists should consider together the possibility that the time has come for ethics to be removed temporarily from the hands of the philosophers and biologicized. The origins of human moral institutions were to be accounted for in terms of the evolutionary history of humanity. The cumulative force of Wilson's argument created a new interest in exploring the biological origins of our ethical beliefs. Wilson's work did not actually propose an alternative ethic, but probed some of the questions that he considered to require further exploration. Are our moral instincts inherited from the past, reflecting long-gone historical contexts? How exactly might we determine which natural dispositions are good and which are bad? When viewed from a strictly scientific perspective, Wilson's approach raised important questions, only some of which could actually be answered scientifically. It is, however, important to take such questions seriously. Is the human capacity for normative guidance to be seen as a biological adaptation which may have conferred a selective advantage in the past, though not necessarily in the present, by enhancing social cohesion and cooperation within groups? And if so, does this invalidate or confirm norms of behavior and feelings? The difficulties begin when anyone tries to move from description to prescription. At the descriptive level, it is relatively easy to appeal to evolutionary theory to offer an explanation of the origins of certain human capacities or patterns of thought and behavior. Proving these explanations, of course, is rather more problematic given the absence of secure hard evidence concerning our distant psychological past. Evolutionary psychology is often invoked to support a postmodern moral skepticism or relativism, or to undermine traditional moral realism. Yet these claims cannot be validated, partly because of the serious difficulties in transitioning from description to prescription, and mainly because of the necessarily provisional and tentative nature of any scientific understanding of the evolutionary past. The problem with approaches to morality based on evolutionary psychology lie not so much in the good questions that are being asked as in the inadequate answers that are being given. Richard Alexander seems to me to sum up the issues rather well. Evolutionary analysis can tell us much more about our history and existing systems of law and norms, and also about how to achieve any goals deemed desirable. But it has essentially nothing to say about what goals are desirable or the directions in which laws and norms should be modified in the future. My own reading of the recent literature in the field suggests that many are simply using evolutionary arguments to lend scientific support to their own moral pre-commitments, whether conservative, liberal, or radical. They seem to use the prestige of science means of disguise and protection, allowing them to smuggle in their own unevidenced moral and metaphysical ideas as if these were the secure outcome of the scientific method. This scientific analysis often rests on a gross oversimplification of the conception of ethics, usually equating good with some measurable concept of well-being and failing to appreciate the difficulty in establishing any meaningful connection between actions that promote human survival and actions that are deemed to be moral. It is not difficult to see why so few people believe it offers a meaningful alternative or corrective to common sense, religious traditions, or social conventions as an inadequate base on which to build a viable system of ethics. Yet ethics remains vitally important to personal and social existence. If science cannot provide us with moral guidance, we look for it somewhere else. The great dream of the Enlightenment was that reason might provide a universal and necessary foundation for ethics, so what about that vision? What remains of it today? For some in contemporary culture, reason and science are the basis of clear and reliable thinking, displacing and disposing all rival sources of authority. It is a vision for which I have sympathy. After all, nobody wants to be irrational. Of course, it is not that simple. The core question that many of my more philosophical colleagues want to ask about an idea is whether it is reasonable. Yet this approach, often encountered within the new atheism, merely locks us into some form of rationalism, which imprisons the scientific enterprise within a rationalist straitjacket, locked into the thought world of the 18th century. Let's look at this in a more detail. Most scholars argue that the modern age of reason began with Socrates' discourse of method and Spinoza's ethics, which held that philosophy was based on truths that were so luminous and arguments that were so compellingly persuasive that reason was able to attain certitude in matters of knowledge. Yet this view was generally abandoned as unworkable and unrealistic during the 20th century. The new atheism is really an antiquated rationalism which has failed to catch up with the philosophical revolution of the 20th century, brought about by pivotal works such as Martin Heidegger's Being in Time, Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, and Hans-Georg Gadamer's Truth and Method. Enlightenment rationalism is now seen as something of a period piece, a philosophy grounded in the assumptions of a long dead and less critical period of human history. Most philosophers would now follow Heidegger's and the late Wittgenstein's and argue that all human thinking, whether philosophical, theological, or ethical, has to be regarded as fiduciary, from the Latin term fiducia, trust, in that its conclusions depend upon commitments whose truth has to be assumed and which cannot be demonstrated. This is not to be seen as a problem unless you are an old-fashioned rationalist. That is, it is just the way things are. We have to learn to live with this and make the most of it. That is good news, and that is good news for both science and religion, both of which are now liberated from an old rationalist dogma that human reason can lay down what the universe is like. It does not, and it cannot. That is why the fundamental question a scientist is going to ask about a theory is not, is this reasonable, but what are the reasons for thinking this is true? We cannot lay down in advance what rationality is characteristic of the universe. We have to find out either by letting the universe itself tell us or by figuring out ways of uncovering it. Scientific rationality is thus best thought of as something that is discovered rather than predetermined or predicted. And sometimes scientific rationality is in conflict with what we might call traditional rationality. I first began to study quantum theory which is wave-particle duality. However, I soon came to see that what was counterintuitive for me was intuitive for those who used to seeing the world through a quantum lens. My problem was that I was approaching quantum theory with a concept of rationality shaped by my experience of the everyday world of classical Newtonian physics. The quantum world was very different. The same issues emerged within the Christian faith. To give one obvious example, the key question to ask about the doctrine of the Trinity is not, is this reasonable? This question presupposes that the rationality of faith may be mapped onto a common sense rationality, whereas the real task of any responsible Christian theology is to discover the internal logic of the Christian faith, not to lay down in advance what form this should take. Quantum mechanics and Christian theology alike are perfectly rational enterprises. The difficulty is that their logic seems counterintuitive if they are judged by the socially constructed notion of common sense, which is biased on an amalgam of cultural expectations and experiences. The doctrine of the Trinity makes perfect sense within the logic of the Christian faith, but not within the austere of an inadequate notion of rationality associated with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment took the view that reason was capable of disclosing a universally valid ethic. It was a wonderful vision, and one that I gladly absorbed when I was a highly idealistic teenager, although I now regard the idea of a universal rational morality as a fiction, a dead times exploded dream. It clearly could be a very useful fiction if everyone could sign up to it as an act of faith. It might sort out a few of the world's problems. So what is wrong with it? The main concern is that its understanding of human reason fails to appreciate the extent to which our patterns of reasoning are shaped by our culture. See, sure, 2 plus 2 is 4, wherever you are. Mathematics and logic are clearly in a class of their own, transcending the boundaries of history and culture. And so is the scientific method, which has universal validity, despite its limits. Yet moral thinking belongs to none of these classes. We now realize that it is dependent on values and judgments embedded within the social context of the thinker. As the philosopher Stephen Tolman points out, the exercise of rational judgment in itself, an activity carried out in a particular context, is essentially dependent on it. The attraction of pure mathematics to rationalist writers lay partly in the fact that it was seen to be the only intellectual activity whose problems and solutions are above time. But mathematics is one thing, reasoning is another. Karl Marx's great insight, originally framed in terms of ideas being the outcomes of socio-economic reality, is that reason is embedded in and shaped by a cultural context. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, one of the more perceptive critics of the attempt by the Age of Reason to forge a universal morality, argues that it tried to confront the world in an empirical, presuppositionless way, which looked good in theory but failed in practice in both his after virtue and whose justice, which rationality. MacIntyre argued that the thinkers of the Enlightenment set out to replace what they took to be discredited traditional and superstitious forms of morality by a kind of secular morality of such impeccable rational credentials that it would secure the assent of any rational person. If these attempts to formulate moral principles to which no adequately reflective rational person could refuse allegiance failed. Why? Because it became clear that enlightenment actually developed a variety of methodologies and conclusions, each claiming to have a compelling rational justification and refusing to concede that its rivals could claim to be rational. Both the thinkers of the Enlightenment and their successors proved unable to agree as to precisely what those principles were, which would be found undeniable by all rational persons. Nor has subsequent history diminished the extent of such disagreement. Consequently, the legacy of the Enlightenment has been the provision of an ideal of rational justification which it has proved impossible to attain. MacIntyre argues the Enlightenment rejected the Aristotelian idea of virtuous life, which has shaped the idea that human beings exist for a purpose and that connecting. Okay. Purpose or goal other than those created for themselves. This theme is taken up in Michael Sandel's perspective criticism of liberal theories of justice. Ignore the fact that ethical debates are unacknowledged conflicts about understanding of human nature and destiny. Sandel, professor of government at Harvard University, emphasizes that justice is instrumental, resting on unprovable visions of the true goals of humanity. Despite all our best intentions to make the law neutral, we cannot define or defend principles of justice without making assumptions about the meaning of the good life. MacIntyre's work did much to challenge the very idea of a rational ethic on the basis of the contested nature of rationality itself, which he has, such as the trite, godless banalities set out at the end of Richard Dawkins' Good Coffee. Tools are designed for purposes. If we want to investigate the structure and behavior of the world, we turn to science. For ethics, we turn to moral philosophy or theology. We cannot afford to be stifled and imprisoned by forms of intellectual tunnel vision which result from declaring that only one method of investigating and representing reality is permissible. Since these things cannot be proved, we have to make judgments about what is right and what is true. Yet these are not arbitrary or irrational judgments, as if rational thought is suspended in order to reach them. As we have argued throughout this work, when one narrative proves inadequate for a given purpose, we are perfectly entitled to draw on additional narratives to help us in our quest for justice in society and personal integrity in our own lives. If we are able to engage these deep questions, we need a larger narrative, another map of meaning to enrich and expand our vision. We may not agree with the specific vision of interconnected narratives that I articulate in this book, but you will end up developing one of your own, whether this is explicitly justified or implicitly assumed. Human beings seem to be meant to develop and work within a greater narrative, however partial and provisional, if we are to provide coherent and credible answers to the great debates about meaning and value now taking place in our culture. That is what we need, and that is certainly what can be developed. In the final chapter of this book, we shall explore how such a great narrative can be developed and inhabited. Okay, so now it is 9:28, and we're in the last chapter. Let me see how long it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. I think I actually have time. I think I'll actually finish the book today. Okay, so chapter 9, Science and Faith. Making sense of the world, making sense of life. In 1930, the British novelist Evelyn Waugh discovered Christianity and the new landscape of intellectual and imaginative possibilities that this opened up for him. Writing later to a friend, he spoke of the delicious process of exploring it limitlessly. This book describes something of my own journey of exploration of the landscape of life, which led me first to an abiding love of science, then to discovery of the intellectual capaciousness of Christianity, and finally into a deeper and richer personal vision of reality that resulted from weaving their threads together. I have tried to explain some of the insights and concerns I experienced and encountered along the way. In bringing this work to a close, I am conscious that I may have failed to convey the sense of excitement that I felt and continue to feel as I explored the landscape of the world in this way. The journey of discovery set out in this work has been made by countless others before me, and I have not hesitated to look through their eyes as I have reflected on the deeper questions that arise as I travel. In the course of this book, I have tried to reflect on concerns that some readers may wish to raise and engage with others who might wish to commend different ways of seeing things. This book is not about defending either science or Christianity. I am happy to leave those tasks to others. What I can do, and perhaps can do better than most, is to explore how they might intertwine and interconnect, offering us a richer palette of colors as we try to depict our beautiful yet complex world and live meaningfully within it. This work is thus more a celebration of intellectual and existential possibilities than a treatise on the foundations of human knowledge. Perhaps the most significant discovery I made while journeying in this way was the limits placed on us as human beings I mentioned earlier. My own hopelessly optimistic view of human nature and capacities as a young man, which led me to ridicule Bertrand Russell's declaration that philosophy taught us how to live without certainty. As a teenager, I was angry that Russell made things needlessly complicated. Now I realize that things are complicated, and that simplistic answers to life's great questions are for children and fools. I have come to terms with the dilemma we are all faced as human beings, so powerfully affirmed by postmodern philosophy, namely, that we cannot prove the things we believe on the basis of good reasons, but believe that we are justified in believing them all the same. Some might see this as a counsel of despair. It is not. It is just an honest recognition of the complexity of our world and our limited ability to grasp its inner workings and deepest meanings. I often share Charles Darwin's hoard doubt beyond the best tools of inquiry at our disposal. The danger, and its real danger, is that we just reduce our vast and complex world to the intellectually manageable and we should hardly be surprised when a serious and committed attempt to think about our world or God causes us mental disorder, and that our minds are being asked to cope with something that lies considerably beyond what they are best adapted to doing, ensuring our survival. In one of his short stories, the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges tells of a moment when a degree of clarity is unexpectedly brought to a decidedly unpromising conversation. It seems it seemed as if a more complex interlocutor had joined the dialogue and moved it on. That is one of the basic themes of this work. It needed the need for a richer, deeper narrative than the offered by science alone, or indeed by anything on its own. Reality is too complex to be comprehended by any form of intellectual tunnel vision. We need multiple windows on our complex world if we are to appreciate it to the full and act rightly and meaningfully within it. Now, there is nothing wrong with seeing only part of the truth, so long as we realize that this is an incomplete vision. The problems begin if we think that reality is limited to what one tradition of investigation can disclose and refuse to listen to any voices other than our own. Reality is complicated. Sure, some people try to reduce it to the intellectually manageable and ridicule those who protest against it, against this simplistic reductionism. Yet our universe is too rich to be exhaustively or even representatively described by one tradition of investigation, one angle of approach, or one level of description. There are so many facets of existence that need to be explored, so many levels of reality to be engaged. We need a dialogue of humanity's greatest and most significant voices, not a monologue from people who think they know everything already and are too heavily invested in defending their own disciplines to listen to anyone else. We need to interweave ideas, approaches, and narratives. Let's see how this might work in our practice. Human beings cannot stop thinking and talking about God, science, and faith. We are naturally drawn to religious questions and intuitions. That is why the rationalist sectarians who feel threatened by the persistence of the divine try have to have it excluded from the public domain as irrational. But we are meant to ask these questions just as we are meant to eat and drink to survive, or to be attracted to other humans to reproduce. That is why our identity and well-being as human beings requires this. These conversations must be allowed to happen. To ask these questions and seek for answers is an integral part of being human. The idea that an interest in questions of faith is something imposed on human beings by religious institutions or authorities is a social construction of the age of reason, which was anxious to portray itself as an intellectual liberator and distract our attention from its notoriously impoverished notion of rationality. But science has moved on, and we now know that religion comes naturally to us, sometimes in the form of a fascination with the transcendent, sometimes through a sense of presence or agency, sometimes through a sense of something ultimate beyond the realm of reason and experience, and sometimes through an awareness of our place within a deeper order of things. That is why we cannot stop talking about ultimate questions such as God and the meaning of life. We seem to be meant to ask such questions. Science and faith are not only the only voices in today's culture that need to be taken seriously, they are, however, widely regarded as two of the most important, if not the most important, movements in our world. This book represents a plea for dialogue, opening the door to an enriched vision of reality. There are some within both the religious and scientific communities who would resist this move, fearing intellectual contamination or loss of focus, who persist in believing that science and faith are locked in some kind of eternal warfare. We have moved beyond these outdated isolationist ideologies, which are now known to rest on highly questionable foundations. There are clearly boundaries issues that need to be negotiated in this most rewarding and creative conversation, but that is true of any relationship worth having in the first place. A significant other often sparks off lines of thought, moments of insight, and challenges to sell ideas. They may be initially threatening, but so often lead to new and richer ways of seeing things. C.S. Lewis once argued that the task of a creative writer was to point away from herself to what she has discovered. In the hope of encouraging others to make that same discovery, in this book I have set out something of my own personal journey, from a sense of rapturous amazement at nature to discovering initially the intellectual delight of the natural sciences, then the elevating and enrichment experience of religious faith, and finally the exploration of the richer vision of reality that resulted from allowing science and faith to inform and illuminate each other. My own journey is not normative. It does not define the way. It does not define the way in which this engagement must take place. It simply illustrates the possibilities opened up by this principled and respectful interweaving of narratives, which allows the reconnection of the otherwise fragmented aspects of our worlds of meaning. My task in this book is not to provide a defense of either science or Christianity, but to explore what happens when they are allowed to speak to each other, quietly and respectfully disregarding the predictable outrage of those tiresome and small-minded guardians of a spurious cultural purity who feel threatened by this discussion and want to close it down before it gets underway. This book can be seen as both an argument for the interweaving of a scientific and Christian narrative and an exploration of the issues and possibilities that emerge when this is done, mapping out the intellectual landscape that is opened up when things are seen in this way. And let me emphasize again that there is no question of turning science into religion, religion into science. Science is science, religion is religion. All that I am proposing is that they talk to each other seriously and respectfully and reflect on the the richly textured way of seeing things which results from doing so. Now, of course, there are many important questions which need to be discussed in any such conversation and interweaving narratives, some of which I have hinted at in this book. But I have painted this picture with broad strokes, hoping to appeal to my readers' imagination as well as to their reason, leaving the final brushwork to heavily annotated and probably rather dull monographs. And in one sense, I have said nothing new, in that such a narrative of enrichment was the common currency of earlier ages. Yet this older narrative has been displaced by a narrative of conflict which assumed cultural dominance for reasons of historical contingency and has sustained that cultural dominance largely through ignorance of the work of the new generation of historians. It is a time to move on, or perhaps to look back and reappropriate and expand what can now be seen to be a wiser and more reflective approach that weaves together science and faith into a deeply satisfying way of seeing our world and grasping our possibilities within it. Now, some readers will rightly want to raise concerns at this point. Let me try and anticipate 3 of them. The first is more likely to be raised by scientists, the second by religious believers, and the third by both. They are all fair concerns and need more engagement. I remember well the first time I saw the moons of the planet Jupiter. Having read some books about astronomy, I built myself a little telescope. On a cold, crisp winter's evening long ago, I turned it to look at the Milky Way and was overwhelmed by the number of stars I could now see. Then I found the planet Jupiter and looked at it. For the first time, I saw its moons. Now, both those moons and the stars were there before I looked at them through my telescope. Yet it enabled me to see them by extending the reach of my natural vision. But sometimes optics distort our vision. During my time as a research student in Oxford University's Department of Biochemistry, I used advanced optical techniques to study temperature-induced changes in biological samples. One set of results from my microscope was especially impressive. If right, they would have changed our understanding of how one particular cell worked. I was naturally suspicious at my unexpected good fortune and got a technician to check out the optics. They were faulty. What I was seeing was an artifact, an illusion created by badly aligned lenses, not something that was really there. That is the concern some will rightly have about the idea of having multiple windows on reality, especially if one of them is religious. Although Richard Dawkins' jaunty little soundbite about God being a delusion is both trite and simplistic, some readers will share concern about the rationality of faith. Might that window turn out to be like my telescope, which allowed an enhancement of vision so that I saw the real world more clearly? Or might it be like my faulty microscope, which created an illusion so that I saw an invented universe with no counterpart in reality? Now, let me be clear, I cannot prove that the approach I am commending is right. But what I can do is invite my readers to step into this way of seeing things and imagine how things look from this perspective. Does it seem to make sense? Does it allow new insights or bring new depths to older ones? I hope that some of the ideas I have explored in the course of this book may be helpful here, but religious readers will want also to raise a point of concern. Let's look at this. In this book, I have emphasized how Christianity makes sense of things, offering a map of the landscape of reality. I gladly endorse C.S. Lewis's words. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Why? Because I have found them to be true to my own experience of reflection and engagement, but some readers may feel that my approach represents a dilution, perhaps even a distortion of the Christian faith. Is Christianity really just about making sense of things? What about the other major themes of faith? Have I not overlooked them, or even airbrushed them out of things? I know what these readers mean, and it's a fair point. There is far more to the Christian faith than I have allowed. I have said little, if anything, about the relational aspects of faith, such as the powerful notion that God is with us even in life's darkest moments. It is a theme beautifully expressed in Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. This sums up the essence of their faith for many Christians. Life's a journey, and God is our constant and faithful companion along its way. And what about beauty and joy? More easily known through worship than through reading works of theology or prayer, or the care of the socially marginalized and disadvantaged, such as an important theme in the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, or the main other themes of the Christian faith that go beyond its thinking about creation or human nature. And what about the imaginative side of faith? Not, I stress, imaginary. That is just something that is made up. The word imaginative invites us to appreciate how an image or story captures our imagination and gives new meaning to our lives by allowing us to see things afresh. It protests against what the French poet Paul Claudel termed the starved imagination of rationalism. For many religious believers, what lies at the heart of the Christian faith is what C.S. Lewis termed a baptized imagination. And it is hard to translate this into an abstract ideas of theology, which often fail to excite our minds or elicit a sense of wonder. Theology is the conversion into words of something that totally resists any such reduction in the first place. That is one of the reasons why Lewis argued that the Christian story took precedence over Christian doctrines. For Lewis, the Christian meta-narrative captured the human imagination and it acted as a vehicle for the theological ideas expressed in the creeds. Some readers will feel that I have presented a rationalized faith shorn of its sense of wonder, joy, and hope. I can understand this concern. Yet I need to make 2 points about this approach I have adopted. First, given cultural concerns about the irrationality of faith found in the writings of Richard Dawkins and others, it is clearly important to reassure readers that faith makes sense in terms of both its grounds and its outcomes. And second, my own discovery of the intellectual capaciousness of faith was an important milestone in my journey of understanding and exploring. It was an unexpected and important moment of insight for me, particularly as I had absorbed the ideas of the more simplistic forms of atheism I encountered as a teenager, above all its rhetoric about the irrationality of both religious faith and religious believers alike. Of course, there is much more to Christianity than this intellectual capaciousness. Others have written far more eloquently than I could ever about the fields of Christianity and spirituality, art, and music. Many theologians emphasize that human reason is ultimately incapable of grasping massive realities such as God. That is why theology talks about mystery, meaning something, and human reason cannot grasp in totality. Yet, despite its religious limits, the approach I have taken works well in exploring the relation of faith and science. It is not the full picture, I willingly concede, but it is an integral aspect of the big picture, which is especially important for the purposes of this book. A third concern, which might well be raised by readers with either a scientific or religious background, is that my approach ultimately amounts to the merging of science and religion, blurring their distinctive boundaries and improperly converting one into the other. I concede that this has happened in the past, but it is not what I am proposing. I gladly acknowledge, respect, and value the distinctive identities and concerns of science and religion, and I make no attempt to fuse them. A colleague of mine died some years ago. He was a distinguished scholar, and I joined many others at his memorial service as a small way of paying my respect to his memory. During the service itself and at the reception afterwards, I heard stories about my colleague, what he was like as a scholar, as a husband, as a father, as a friend, as someone who loved walking. Each of these stories illuminated one of his aspects, but none defined him as a person. Um, he was each of these, and yet more than any of them, which need multiple perspectives to do justice to the complexity and richness of our universe. My approach is best described in terms of the interweaving of narratives. We saw earlier how human beings construct their identities using multiple narratives. That is how human beings function as social animals. We weave together religious, political, social, and cultural narratives as we try to make sense of our world. They are inadequate black and white view of the world. It is natural for us to weave the threads of these narratives together, just as it is natural for us to try to sort out how they interact, which takes priority at which points in how we resolve tensions or seeming contradictions between them. Mary Midgley's idea of multiple maps or multiple windows through which we view reality expresses a similar theme. No one story, no one angle of gaze or tradition of investigation is adequate to deal with human existence and all its richness and complexity. This interweaving of narratives is essential as we deal with the ultimate questions that persistently refuse to go away. To answer these properly, we need to bring together multiple approaches and recognize the existence of multiple levels of meaning, such as purpose in life, values, a sense of individual efficacy, and a basis for self worth. What I am proposing is not some crude homogenization of narratives. It is like an artist's palette. Each color needs to be valued in its own right and used appropriately to render the rich texture and vibrancy of our world. It is an approach with potentially rich scientific, religious, and cultural elements, which connects up with main discussions and concerns today, such as the problem of two cultures set out by C.P. Snow in a lecture at Cambridge University on May 7, 1959. Whatever Snow actually intended to say in that lecture, it has been seized upon as marking the dichotomization of the modern mind, posting the mutual ignorance and hostility that exists between the natural sciences and the humanities, that pleading for the cultural and intellectual enrichment that could result from greater interaction. This book is a small contribution to Snow's plea for interdisciplinary dialogue, aiming to explore some of the intellectual possibilities that might result. So, how might science enrich faith, or faith enrich science? There are many ways in which the natural sciences can enrich a narrative of faith. For example, consider the words of Psalm 19:1. The heavens are telling the glory of God. Science expands our vision of those heavens, enabling us to grasp more of their vastness and thus deepening our sense of wonder as we reflect on our universe. It helps us to appreciate the immensity of the heavens, adding rich layers of interpretation to our sense of amazement at the night sky. Or think of the theme of forgiveness, of central importance to the Christian faith, which is given theological articulation in doctrines of the atonement. Science expands our grasp of this notion by helping us understand the empirical difference that forgiveness makes to individuals and communities, thus enabling the development of more effective pastoral strategies. Yet I suspect that few readers of this book will need to be persuaded of how science might bring added depth to faith. They will more likely want to ask hard questions about ways in which a narrative of faith might enrich a scientific way of thinking. Let's turn to think about this. In my own experience, there are three main ways in which Christianity enriches the scientific narrative. First, it provides us with a reassurance of the coherence of reality that, however fragmented our world of experience may seem, there is a half-glimpsed bigger picture which holds things together. Its threads connecting together in a web of meaning that might otherwise seem incoherent and pointless. This theme resonates throughout the poetic and religious writings of the Middle Ages. As might be expected, it is a major issue and perhaps the greatest of medieval literary classics, Dante's Divine Comedy. As the poem draws to its close, Dante catches a glimpse of the unity of the cosmos in which its aspects and levels are seen to converge into a single whole. Yet the modern period has seen doubts of the coherence of reality, many arising from the new philosophy of the scientific revolution. Do new scientific ideas destroy any idea of a meaningful reality? The English poet John Donne spoke movingly of this concern in the early 17th century, as scientific discoveries seemed to some to erode any sense of connectedness and continuity within the world. "'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone," he wrote of this unsettling new world. How could it be held together? So we have lost sight of the idea of some deeper unity of reality. Um, so have we lost sight of the idea of some deeper unity of reality? Where once there was a sense of intellectual and moral coherence to reality, there now seems to be what the great German poet and novelist Hermann Hesse once described as mere aggregation of intellectual passions and the transitory values of the day. Other intellectual developments have also posed a threat to the notion of a coherent reality, including contemporary philosopher Nancy Cartwright's idea of a doubled world, where C.S. Lewis argued that we are not reading rationality into an irrational universe, but responding to our rationality with which the universe has already been saturated. Cartwright holds that we are imposing an order of or rationality when there may be none, or indeed there may be a variety of orderings requiring multiple accounts of the natural world and its structures. For Lewis, we are responding to the universe as it actually is. For Cartwright, we run the risk of inventing our own universe and disregarding the one around us. Christianity provides a web of meaning, a deep belief in the fundamental interconnectedness of things, which holds Dawn's pieces together. Christians find this theme eloquently expressed in the New Testament, which speaks of all things holding together in Christ, Colossians 1:17. There is a hidden web of meaning and connectedness behind the, in the ephemeral and coherent world that we experience. This was the insight which consistently eluded the novelist Virginia Woolf, who occasionally experienced short, stabbing instances of insight which seemed to her to reveal some real thing behind appearances. These transitory and rare moments of being, as she called them, convinced her that there were hidden webs of meaning and connectedness behind the world she knew. Yet she could never enter this hidden world. It always seemed to retreat from her as she approached its door, as if she were grasping at smoke. Second, as we noted earlier, Christianity provides answers to the scientifically unanswerable, to what Karl Popper termed ultimate questions, such as the meaning of life and our place in a greater scheme of things. These are to be seen as supplementations of the rigorous and consistent application of the scientific method, protecting us against the existential vacuum that results from seeing science alone as the foundation of meaning and value. Religious faith thus provides a framework of meaning which not merely helps us grasp the contours of reality more firmly, but inspires us to want to pursue the good and the beautiful. Like many before me, I found that this enabled me to reconcile the intellectual demands and pleasures of scientific thought with the sense of purpose and fulfillment that a rich spiritual life can provide. Of course, such religious frameworks of meaning cannot be rationally or empirically verified. Yet this is a disadvantage that they share with any meta-narrative that goes beyond the empirical evidence and reflects on deeper questions of meaning and value. The author Salman Rushdie is severely and widely critical of any ideology that claims to have a complete totalized explanation of the world. Both science and religion can easily become ideologies, above all, when they assert that they alone have a monopoly of truth. That is the era of both religious fundamentalism and science imperialism. It is an unavoidable error. I have argued for multiple maps of the levels of reality and multiple narratives about life, not simply because reality itself is so complex that it demands this form of representation, but also to challenge any pretensions of ultimacy on the part of either science or religion. And third, religion is able to enrich a scientific narrative by preventing it from collapsing into a technocratic, dull catalog of common things. The sociologist Max Weber used the term disenchantment to refer to an excessively intellectual and rationalizing way of looking at nature, which limited it to what could be measured and quantified. A religious perspective does not in any way deny the scientific utility of such a rationalizing approach. It simply insists that there is more that needs to be said if a full and satisfying account of reality is to be provided, and offers a supplementation of a scientific narrative by which this might be achieved. To bring this work to a close, I shall reflect on some remarks by two outstanding scientists, Albert Einstein and Carl Sagan. These help us to consider how the narrative of faith might enrich and deepen a scientific way of looking at things. I first began to read about Einstein's theory of relativity in my early teens. I found Einstein's account of the complex world of X, Y, Z, and T fascinating, not least the deep conceptual questions that it raised about the nature of space and time. It did not bother me at the time, but I could not help but notice that this was a remarkably impersonal and abstract account of space and time framed in terms of world lines. where I wondered, did I fit into this map of space and time? This thought came back to me when reading Einstein's correspondence as background research for this book. I was particularly struck by one of his later letters, written a few months before his death. It was a letter um, of condolence, written to the family of Michel Besso, a lifelong friend of Einstein who died in March 1955. In the letter, Einstein expressed his sadness at his friend's death and reflected on his reaction to the news. Now he departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing, for believing physicists like us know that the distinction between past, present, and future has only the meaning of a persistent illusion. If you know your theory of relativity, you can see exactly what Einstein meant. At one level, he is right, but for most of us, his comment will be existentially unsatisfying. That Besso had died before Einstein means nothing. For most people, that subjective distinction between past, present, and future is real and matters profoundly. Physics says one thing, psychology says something very different. Yes, human life is incredibly brief when seen against the backdrop of cosmic time, but it is the only life we have. We occupy only a tiny slice of the four dimensions of space-time, and we want to live good and meaningful lives. While we can certainly organize our experiences of time using the abstract framework of space-time, this framework is not in itself capable of delivering the existential payload that is of such personal significance to us. Human beings are both objects and subjects. Each of us has our own now, which we distinguish from earlier events, which we remember, and from future events, which we anticipate or imagine. That is why narratives are so important. They allow us to make sense of our place in the flow of time. Our construction of the present is often framed in terms of recalling the past and anticipating the future. As Einstein's analysis makes clear, all too often science treats us as objects rather than as subjects, so that its description of our situation are not descriptions of what we actually feel. That is why we need a greater narrative which can weave together facts and meaning. That is why we seek for a richer vision of reality which engages both the cognitive and existential dimensions of life. Einstein himself was acutely aware of this problem, as can be seen from a conversation with the philosopher Rudolf Carnap. Carnap spent some time at the for Advanced Studies at Princeton, where he had the opportunity to talk with Einstein about philosophical issues arising from his research. As Carnap later recalled in his personal memoirs, the problem of now worried Einstein seriously. He explained that the experience of the now means something special for men, something different from the past and the future, but that this important difference does not and cannot occur within physics. Carnap described Einstein as painfully resigned to the inability of science to grasp this experience, the existential importance of which could hardly be denied. Einstein thought that these scientific descriptions cannot possibly satisfy our human needs, that there is something essential about the now, which is just outside the realm of science. The problem here arises from the exclusion of the perceiving subject from physical science, a development which the Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger traced back to the ancient Greek natural philosophy. Yet the I perspective lies at the root and heart of the human condition. It cannot be excluded from any existentially meaningful account of reality. It has to be brought back in, and that requires the expansion, enrichment, or correction of narratives that are deficient in this critically important respect. The point is clear. According to Carnap, Einstein believed that scientific descriptions cannot possibly satisfy our human needs. There is no suggestion on Einstein's part that the existential shortcomings of these scientific descriptions were an indication of their falsity, which is clearly not the case. Einstein was simply aware that we as thinking and reflecting human beings need more than these scientific descriptions. Our needs as human beings, which should and must be incorporated into any humane philosophy, require that these should be supplemented from beyond the realm of science. Thus, representing a different level of engagement, such approaches are capable of supplementing this scientific account, allowing the richer engagement with the issue than would otherwise be the case. It is not difficult to see how this issue fits into a greater narrative, with a long history in philosophy and theology concerning the intensely problematic object-subject relation. Schrödinger himself identified this relation as lying at the heart of quantum mechanics. In a letter to the physicist Arnold Sommerfeld in 1931, the Austrian philosopher Ferdinand Ebner and the German Jewish philosopher and mystic Martin Buber both wrote significant works on this theme in the 1920s, picking up on a concern that excessive objectivism was inadequate to do justice to the existential and relational needs of human beings, precisely the point that Einstein was apparently concerned about. The same themes were developed in most explicitly religious ways in the 5th century by Augustine of Hippo, now widely regarded as one of the earliest writers to explore the issue of autobiographical memory. Augustine's analysis of the nature of time emphasizes both the awareness of the subjective time in which the individual thinker exists and the awareness of the individual existing in subject time. The research of Karl Spooner at Harvard University for human identity, as well as creating space for a religious or metaphysical enrichment of the notion, along the lines found in Augustine's classic text, The Confessions. Without in any way losing sight of the insights about space and time embedded in Einstein's theory of relativity, Augustine offers an approach which articulates and preserves the subjective importance of the present moment, providing a framework for affirming the significance of memories of the past and hopes for the future. This richer narrative allows multiple insights to be integrated in a manner that respects disciplinary boundaries, while at the same time ensuring that the big picture and not just a part of it is fully grasped and appreciated. Now, this is a complex and perhaps demanding example, yet it helps us to see how a scientific narrative can be, and in Einstein's view, needed to be, enriched without being distorted. Physicist David Mermin remarks that it is time to consider what other foundational puzzles can be resolved by restoring the balance between subject and object in physical science. He is right, and the greater narratives that might help us with this task are already there, just waiting to be used. Einstein's anguished recognition that scientific descriptions cannot satisfy human existential needs led him to conclude that something else of essential importance lay just outside of the realm of science. Many know that experience within and beyond the natural sciences. C.S. Lewis had a haunting awareness of something lying beyond the horizon of experience, like a distant flower whose fragrance was wafted toward him by a passing breeze. The author Salman Rushdie spoke of these moments of intuitions of transcendence as the flight of the human spirit outside the confines of its material physical existence. Isaac Newton expressed much the same idea when he spoke of science as standing on the shoreline of greater truth, too often preoccupied with the accumulation of observations and missing their ultimate significance. I seem to have been only like a small boy playing on the seashore, diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than the ordinary whistle. The great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. I know the feeling. I remember looking at the night sky in the winters of the late 1960s and seeing the belt of Orion, 3 bright stars in the constellation of Orion. I was an atheist back in those days, with no interest in God. Like many, I felt a deep sense of awe at the wonder of nature, which was intensified by the beauty of the night sky. I had a sense of standing on the threshold of something that my reason told me was imaginary, yet some deeper intuition told me was profoundly significant. That intuition never entirely went away, remaining as a soft voice within me, whispering words of doubt about my slick and simple atheism. To admit that at the time I found the sight of the night sky unsettling, calling into question the existential adequacy of my subtle rationalist assumptions. I knew enough about astronomy to know that light took hundreds of years to travel to Earth from those stars. To look at those stars in the belt of Orion was in effect to travel back in time. I was seeing them as they were, not as they are. By the time the light now leaving those stars reached Earth, I would be dead. Those stars thus became symbols of my own mortality, chilling silent reminders of the brevity of human life. The universe might be very beautiful, but it also seemed wholly pointless. My atheist mental map of that time led me to believe that the universe was cold and indifferent to me. There seemed to be a chilling impersonality in the laws of nature. I was of no consequence. As the atheist chemist Peter Atkins later put it, the universe was a machine driven by motiveless, purposeless decay. Although I was in one sense a product of nature, it did not care about me.
At that stage in my life, I saw the night sky as a talisman of the heartless cosmic indifference, similar to that I found in the classic Persian poem, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And that inverted bowl they call the sky, where under a crawling cooped we live and die. Lift not your hands to it for help, for it as impotently moves as you or I. That sense of cosmic pointlessness haunts many today, particularly within the scientific community. Ursula Goodenough, a biologist at the University of Washington, recalls being overwhelmed with terror at the thought of the immensity of the universe and the fact that it would one day come to an end. No longer she could no longer could she appreciate the beauty of the stars. They came to represent or symbolize deeper and unsettling truths that she found unbearable. The night sky was ruined. I could never be able to look at it again. I wept into my pillow the long, slow tears of adolescent despair. A bleak emptiness overtook me whenever I thought about what was really going on about in the cosmos or deep in the atom, so I did my best to not think about such things. I know exactly how good I felt. Although in my own phase as an atheist, I was willing to stare into the abyss of despair. If that was the way things were, I thought I had better get used to it. I would have to face up to reality and ignore any seductive thoughts of meaning or hope or metaphysical comfort. In my first term studying science at Oxford University, I finally realized that this was simply a way of looking at things, not a factual account of things. I was imposing meaninglessness onto the cosmos. It was what you saw when you looked at the world with one unacknowledged set of theoretical spectacles. So, what happens if you put on a different set of spectacles? What if the world was to be seen through guidelines, through a theistic schema? I came to discover that the night sky looked like rather different when seen from the standing point of view. Um, the narrative of faith affirmed my sense of awe in the presence of a vast universe, while adding a layer of interpretation that enabled me to see myself in a new manner. I might be very small, overwhelmed by the majesty of the cosmos, but I matter to God. As I read those words, I seemed trite and even simplistic. Um, Yet that thought changes everything. As Salman Rushdie points out, religion helps us understand why life so often makes us feel small by telling us what we are smaller than and contrary wise because we also have a sense of being special. The narrative of faith gives us a framework which allows us to hold together the ideas of cosmic vastness and personal significance in a coherent whole. One of the world's most famous photographs was taken in 1990 from the Voyager space probe during its mission to study the outer solar system. 12 years after its launch, it reached the planet Saturn and sent back images of this great planet. The astronomer Carl Sagan suggested the probe's cameras should send back an image of Earth seen from a distance of about 37 billion miles. After much discussion, NASA agreed. Back came the famous image of a pale blue dot set against the darkness of space, a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. As Sagan rightly pointed out, this distant image of our tiny world set everything in perspective. How small, how insignificant we are compared with the vastness of space. To this day, I keep looking at the image from Voyager, that minuscule pale blue dot which is our cosmic home, and I find my thoughts straying to one of the Psalms, which seems to anticipate the thoughts and emotions I experience when looking at that lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for? 3 through 4. The psalm exalts that human beings are part of God's creation and are named and loved by the God from whom all things come. Our lives are touched by transcendence. If this narrative of faith is right, and I cannot prove that it is, then there is a bigger picture, a vast picture, but each of us is part of it, and each of us can make a difference. In conclusion, this book is an interim report from the frontiers of science and faith, a promissory note which can never aspire to be finished or perfect, partly because the fields are moving, and partly because there is too much for one person to take in and assimilate. Like science, any enriched narrative must be revisional. Like religion, it can be illuminating and inspiring. I am still on my voyage of discovery, which has led me to see the world and myself in a new way. through new eyes and to reflect on the great questions of life through interacting with other minds and imagination greater than my own. Marcel Proust captured the challenge and promise of such an intellectual journey beautifully in one of his novels. Only the true voyage of discovery, the only fountain of youth, would not would not would be not to travel to new landscapes, but to possess other eyes, to behold the universe through the eyes of another, of 100 others. This book maps my own journey of discovery and intellectual realignment, which led me to develop and embrace an enriched narrative of reality, weaving together the narratives of science and the Christian faith. I am not seeking to impose this on anyone. I do, however, want to share what I have found and explain why I find it so intellectually resilient and existentially satisfying. This method of weaving narratives together is not limited to science and Christianity. Other strands can easily be added. I have tried and probably failed to convey the sense of delight and intellectual fulfillment, and I find in exploring the vibrant vision of reality that results when science and faith are allowed to critique and enrich each other. The borderlands of science and faith are contested and poorly marked, yet where some see borders as things do to be defended and polished or policed, I see them as porous, calling out to be explored ourselves to one tradition of inquiry or one map of reality. We all need a greater narrative to make sense of the world and our lives, naturally weaving together multiple narratives, levels, and maps to give us the greatest traction or engaged and inhabited um, using only one traction of investigation. Despite its shortcomings, this book tries to act as Borges' more complex interlocutor, aiming to move out cultural conversation on in more satisfying directions. We need the best picture of reality that we can devise if we are to inhabit it meaningfully and authentically. Why should we rest content with a monochrome picture of reality when an enriched vision allows us to use a full palette of um, of colors and appreciate it more fully? This richer vision provides a big picture of things which possesses existential traction and not merely cognitive functionality. It is a way of seeing things which enables us to not simply to exist, but to live. And that, my friends, is the big question. If you do not own this book, I would highly recommend this not only to religious or spiritual people, but to also atheists. So, with that, that is my vlogging book series. I did The Lies We Believe About God, The Yoga of Jesus, and The Big Question. I have thought about what I want to look about next, or what I want to do another vlog on, whether it's something fun or serious or in between. And I feel like with, with what I've got going on right now, like I'm working, and then I've also got, all these books that I want to read, and then also when I have time, I am watching a Big Bang Theory marathon every day. I think that maybe for about a month or until I finish the Big Bang Theory marathon, I think I'm going to take a break from YouTubing and blogging. I'll still be here. I'll just it'll just kind of take me. I just kind of want to take a break from this. Just to go through, just to focus on my life and everything, and just take a break from, sharing it with the world. 2 hours and 7 minutes. Wow, I went really long. But before I before I go, I want to share with you my overall thoughts of the big question. Overall, I liked it. Again, this is basically just like any other book. There are things that I agree with. There are things that I probably wouldn't necessarily say that I don't agree with, but I am, trying to grasp and wrestle with and everything. But one of the things that I loved about this book was that it's similar to the Yoga of Jesus, in the sense that the Yoga of Jesus was exploring hidden messages and meanings within the parables that he taught, and the fact that there is science behind them, and trying to find common ground with that, and then kind of going into more in depth with finding common ground between science and religion, is definitely intriguing, because we live in a world where I feel like there are people who feel like you have to be a religious or scientific or atheist. An atheist, you can't be both. And I have had people, a couple people in my life who are both, I wouldn't say religious, but they're spiritual, and they also are really into science and everything. But yeah, those are my overall thoughts on the book. And then I'm going to leave you with the credo of Penn Jillette's book, God No. That's the book that I'm going to be reading next, the first book on my own. But basically, I'm just going to be giving you the credo of it, and then basically give you the overall view of what it's about, based on the author. So his credo is, if God, however you perceive him, her, had told you to kill your child, would you do it? If your answer is no, then in my book you're an atheist. There is doubt in your mind. Love and morality are more important to you than your faith. If your answer is yes, please reconsider. So that's his credo, and then basically what this book is, it's basically his take on the Ten Commandments, which is definitely intriguing to me right off the bat. Now, again, not everything will I agree in the book, but there will be some things that I probably will agree with and some things we'll wrestle with. So that's my video.